This is Alex Young, and today I'm joined by my co host, Mark Pock, and our guest, Professor Colin Marshall. Professor Marshall, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so to start off with, could you tell us about your journey in the world of philosophy? What brought you here?
I guess the journey started in high school when I had a class where we read some Plato, and I scribbled a lot of things in the margins and was very excited. I have no idea in retrospect what exactly I was excited about, but I got the idea that philosophy was fun. It gave my brain something to chew on other than itself, which was a real win at the time. So then I had the idea that I would study philosophy when I went to college, but the whole idea was I was going to go do a respectable job, like be a high school teacher. And that was the job when I started college. I took some philosophy classes. Some went not so great, some went pretty well. And then I got the idea of maybe being an academic. I was sort of worried this was a socially irresponsible choice. So I had to talk with a few people about it, and eventually got reassurance that I was not just a totally corrupt human being for wanting to go into the academy. My parents were all right with it. My friends seemed okay with it. So I applied to some grad schools, and um, yeah, things worked out. And then once I was locked in, then it was sort of taking off from there. I think the history of philosophy was always a big hook for me. It wasn't the main thing that I was interested in, but it was the main thing that I seemed to come up with things that other people thought were worthwhile.
Well, let's jump right into Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is really fun for us as well. Schopenhauer maybe is not well known as others like Nietzsche or Marx, but we at least find him one of the most darkly fascinating thinkers of the modern era. Can you start off by just giving us a broad overview of some of the most interesting points of Schopenhauer's philosophy?
Absolutely. Schopenhauer was kind of a pathetic person. Other big name philosophers, it's really easy to kind of deify. You imagine Kant as this hyper rational God, imagine Nietzsche as this bold iconoclast. But Schopenhauer was pretty clearly a miserable little man who was just filled with biases and insecurities. It was narcissistic. For me, this is part of his appeal because he seems so intensely human that when he wrestles with things like suffering in life, or how do we engage with art, or how do we relate to other beings when we know they're mostly selfish and self absorbed and would easily trample all over us, it feels authentic. It feels like it's earned. It feels, even when he's self congratulatory, you can kind of see through it. So I found that really compelling. In terms of his views, he's a bit of an outlier in 19th century German philosophy. So after Kant dies at the very beginning of the 19th century, most German philosophers think good philosophy has to be really hard, filled with jargon, and bend your brain at every sentence. Schopenhauer goes against this trend. His view is it should be clear, it should be brutally honest, and you don't need torturous sentences to get the truth across. His philosophical views, I think, are his philosophical views are really rich, and I actually think a lot of them presage stuff that happened in 20th century analytic philosophy. For example, his metaphysical views, he is a sort of radical monist, believing that everything is fundamentally one in the mystical tradition. Another key part of his view is that compassion is a way of registering each other's suffering in a perceptual sort of registering, not just knowing that others are suffering, but actually perceiving it. He ties this to his metaphysical monism. I think he's got a great insight there that actually doesn't require the bold metaphysics. This was, in a way, what my first book was exploring, was how to get the Schopenhauerian idea without any of the intense Neoplatonic metaphysics attached to it. But I think he's really on to something profound there about the way that morality is based in a type of perception without any fancy talk about irreducible moral properties. Another one of his key ideas, which I'll be exploring in a class next year, is on political philosophy side. So in the 19th century, a lot of philosophers were getting really excited about the state being this organ that would manifest absolute freedom and would bring us into some sort of glorious utopia. This was a really exciting idea. People like Hegel really championed this. That inspired Marx and others. And Schopenhauer was intentionally old school about this. He was suspicious about all these grand ideas of state progress and humanity realizing some perfect state where we would be full of peace and knowledge and science. In his view, humans are irredeemably, unchangeably egoistic, selfish, and often malicious. He thought there could be individual cases of people who rise above that, but never as a whole. So politically, he thought, we have to keep our eye on the ball. And the ball is the state is here to keep us from slaughtering each other and exploiting each other ruthlessly. So against these highfalutin ideals that he saw about freedom and justice and self-realization, over and over, he insisted, no, the point is to make sure we don't kill each other. Let's just not lose track of that. And that's something that I find at the present social political moment is really a valuable idea, to think about making politics really just about the basic preservation and meeting of basic needs of everybody, as opposed to pursuing some more grandiose vision that may or may not fit with human nature. Not to say I think he's right about this, but I think this is an idea that really should be in play.
Well, before we pick up on some of those threads, which are all deeply fascinating and cover a lot of the grounds that we're hopefully going to get to, what do you differ from Schopenhauer on? You've highlighted a lot of things which are hopefully good. Is there anything that you think is distinctively wrong or needed to be distinctively revised in order to be incorporated into your philosophy? Or things that he struggled with and simply never found a way out of?
Yeah, I like this question. One thing that I can't get on board with is his deep metaphysical monism. So he believes that fundamentally there is just one thing. He calls it the will. He's even reluctant to call it a thing, but there is a fundamental oneness. And he's intentionally building on a long tradition of monism coming out of not just Plato and Neoplatonists, but also South and East Asian traditions in philosophy. And he really does believe that there was a massive intercultural convergence on the truth in this. I think deep radical monism is super cool, but I can't honestly sign up for it yet. Wouldn't rule it out, but it just seems it's a very high entry price if you need it for his other philosophical claims, most of which I think you don't. So that's one. Another point where I just can't get on board is he has a belief which he ties to Buddhist and Gnostic traditions that the highest level of realization is a form of self-negation, where you negate your will and somehow destroy the core of your essence and then sort of fade away. And for him, that is a higher standpoint or higher sort of achievement than you get even in ordinary ethics of compassion. So he thinks ethics, which he understands as compassion, not causing each other to suffer, trying to help each other, that he describes as merely a stepping stone to this ascetic viewpoint. I think metaethically, that's kind of a cool move, but I'm really a fan of compassion. I don't think that self-negation, denial of your will, transcendence is the appropriate thing to do when you're surrounded by suffering that you could potentially alleviate. So that's one where I break with him theoretically, though it's one thing I find encouraging is he himself never made an attempt to become an ascetic. So he stayed at the level of ordinary morality and immorality. And he thought this ascetic turn was a sort of ideal, but one beyond the reach of most people. So it's a break with him in theory more than in practice.
Well, on that point, if, as Schopenhauer believed, most people are egoistic most of the time and suffering is essentially fundamental, how do we go about alleviating that suffering? So you talked about compassion as a means towards alleviating that suffering. Why is that possible? And is that something that can actually inform the way that we live in practice? Or I suppose this is getting at the question of how do we live a tolerable life?
Yeah, great. There's a person level answers to that question and then more social level. And these are things I'm trying to hammer out in the book. Some parts of his answers are more straightforward. Others are a little trickier to untangle. On the personal level, one of the main things he thinks we need to do is first give up on the idea that we are entitled to happiness. So in his view, if we start with the idea that we should be happy, and then we find that we're not, we'll feel wronged, we'll feel that life is unfair, we'll feel mistreated. He thinks we need to give that up. That instead of demanding a happy life and feeling indignation when we don't get it, we should aim for a tolerable life. That's a realistic bar, he thinks. If we are lucky in our external circumstances, if our basic needs are met, a tolerable life might be within our reach. To get a tolerable life, he thinks one of the most important things we need is self-knowledge. And here he's drawing on a long tradition. But for him, the main challenge in acquiring self-knowledge is to watch yourself play out. Discover, for example, how much egoism, malice, and compassion do you have? So not, for example, signing yourself up for a career that requires more compassion than you have. Not ignoring your malice, recognizing all of us have some desire to punch down or punch sideways or punch up. Finding ways to sort of allocate that without it interfering. So you don't want to punch at the same people who you're trying to exercise your compassion on, for example. Understanding our own tendencies and our own limitations, he thinks, is really crucial. So he's quite critical, for example, of the Stoics, who thought if you just take the right attitude, you can get a grip and things will be okay. I think that's a nice idea. But realistically, what it takes to get the right attitude always has to be answerable to our needs, and we can't ignore our needs. In his case, he thought that he needed discovered that he needed a certain degree of solitude. And so Stoic recommendations about, just roll with it, Arthur. Just, put up with the fools around you. He thought that's unrealistic. That sort of mistake comes from assuming that the general possibilities for human existence apply to each one of us. So some people can handle the situation, why can't I? That's a place where he thinks we're often making a mistake, and that if we come to appreciate our own limitations, we see that's just not for me. So if we do that, if we acquire that self-knowledge, we can avoid some avoidable forms of profound suffering. There's still going to be small-scale suffering because, of course, we get hungry and tired and our bodies deteriorate. But we can at least mitigate some of the problems. So that's part of it. Another element he thinks is letting ourselves have aesthetic escapes, where, in his view, what happens when you appreciate the beauty of something, whether it's a natural object or an artistic object, is you actually get a break from the whole business of willing and desiring altogether. He thinks those breaks are always finite. Eventually your back's going to start hurting, or your feet are tired in the museum, or you get too hungry. Nonetheless, these are profound breaks where you actually get something that is neither pain or suffering nor boredom, at least for a while. Discovering your own artistic sensibility is something he thought was extremely important. Then there's the social political level. What do we do to make our lives more tolerable there? He's a little less explicit about this, but I think looking at the particular political causes he tried to make progress on, there is a pattern. And the pattern is, first, to avoid the mistake of thinking that because something is bad, we should try to change it. In his view, no, existence is always going to be bad. That's just the fabric of our being, is suffering, pain, and boredom. We can avoid it to certain degrees, but never permanently. So we shouldn't let the fact that something is bad decide our actions. Instead, we should look at cases where there is obviously a large contingent increase in suffering. So one of his examples was the slave trade. There he thought, you can see there are some countries that do not have the slave trade, there are some that do, and there is vastly more suffering in cases of slavery. And this, he saw, this is something that we could just not have. So he was writing after the abolition of slavery in Britain, hadn't yet been abolished in the United States. And he thought, this is a thing that is actually worth putting some time into. It's not just that slavery is bad, it's that it is significantly and obviously worse in terms of suffering than societies without it. Another example he was passionate about was things like dogfighting and abuse of non-human animals. There again, he said, look, there are places where people have where governments have instituted penalties for abuse of non-human animals, and there is less suffering there. We could do that. So on the level of collective action, the recommendation is look for large contingent differences in suffering and then work to alleviate those.
This is perhaps a basic question, and a question maybe you could ask of many people. What, especially if Schopenhauer believes that the ultimate theoretical apex of humanity is annihilation of our own will and of our own essence, what should compel us at all to care about the suffering of others, perhaps on the social level or even on a personal level? Why should we care, especially when caring might increase our own suffering that smallest bit more?
Great. And this is one of, I think, Nietzsche's most important critiques of Schopenhauer, is that if suffering is bad and compassion or Mitleid is suffering with, isn't this just making more of a bad thing? I think this is an important objection. I also think there's an answer to it, which is the value of compassion is a different sort of moral value than the reduction of suffering. So having compassion is a way of being virtuous. Being virtuous does not by itself make the world better in the way that a reduction in suffering does. These are different types of moral value. So, for example, if you have a world filled with suffering and you add a virtuous person who's made miserable by this, yes, you have increased the amount of suffering in the world. Other things equal, you should not do that, especially if the compassionate person cannot alleviate the suffering. Virtue is a different kind of moral value. It's a recognition of what's there. So I think separating these two dimensions of value, what is the basic good and bad, suffering and its lack, versus what is virtue, the recognition of that suffering, that's the way to make it coherent. In terms of the higher standpoint he mentions, it's a tougher question, but one way to read him is as saying, and this is the way I hope he can be read, that this higher standpoint where someone negates the will, they achieve escape from everything, that has to go through a deep grasp with suffering. That it's only through a full visceral recognition of the suffering of the world that you're able to achieve this escape. And he doesn't think you can skip. You can't say, oh, well, I'm not going to go through full visceral suffering. I'm just going to stop caring. He thinks that's metaphysically impossible. That kind of deep, enlightened apathy is only possible through being burned by the flames of suffering. That's actually his interpretation of the Christian New Testament. As I said, I'm not super enthusiastic about this part of his view, but it is one where he thinks compassion is an extremely important stepping stone before you get to this saint-like denial of the will.
One last related question on this general note of how to live a tolerable life and perhaps morality and ethics. Schopenhauer seems to be something like a determinist, and as you said earlier, he wants to annihilate modality in his account of reality. What sort of choice do we have in any of these matters? Is there any moral accountability that can be ascribed if I choose to increase the suffering, if I choose, quote unquote, to increase the suffering of another person? And are the factors which we mentioned before, the sort of partition into an idea of recognition and an idea of merely decreasing the suffering that is in the world, are those factors factors which are in and of themselves sort of intrinsically valuable, or are they factors which we must first recognize as valuable in order to take up? Is there any force inherent to those factors, if you will?
Great. So I'll try part of that and tell me if I'm missing part of the question. He is opposed to voluntarist views of free will, where the future is open to you and nothing in antecedent conditions forces you one way or another. So he rejects that level of free will. And with it, he also rejects certain notions of responsibility. In particular, notions of responsibility whereon one person generates, say, a causal chain involving good or evil, and therefore deserves reward or punishment as the starting point of that causal chain. That's a view that Immanuel Kant, for example, seems to endorse. René Descartes seems to endorse it. Schopenhauer rejects it. So he doesn't think that anyone as an individual is the source of anything. We are given our characters in combination with our circumstances yield certain events for good or for ill. So as a result, he's an anti-retributivist. He doesn't believe that punishment is ever justified as a retaliation, as a getting back of the source of things. He does endorse punishment. He thinks that political punishment is valuable as a deterrence, but that's really it for him. That said, he does believe there is a kind of deep responsibility that each of us have for the world. And this is a moment of pessimism, but it's also something that I think is supposed to be a step towards living a tolerable life. So in his view, the essence of all things, which he calls the will, is there in each of us. It is the source of restlessness, of pain, of boredom, of misery, of striving. And none of us is exempt. This is the core of each of our being. One thing this preempts is certain forms of righteous indignation. So if you look at someone else who has done something cruel or stupid or mean, he thinks there is only so much you can look down on them. It was probably in large part a differences in circumstances that you yourself haven't done something cruel or stupid or mean, because all of us have the potential. He does think there are differences in personalities. Some people are much more prone to cruelty than others, but no one, he thinks, is exempt from it. As a result, he thinks there is a kind of deep existential guilt that it's appropriate to feel as we look out on the horrors of the world, to say, this is coming from my essence as well. The very thing that defines me is the source of all this. And that kind of deep responsibility is, I think, part of what generates, on the one hand, the denial of the will, ultimately, but also, more on the side that I like, on the side of compassion, a deep sense of unity with other beings. So he recommends, for example, that if you want to feel connection to others, don't try to convince yourself that they're fundamentally good people, because he thinks that's a fool's errand. If you look closely, you will see people are largely self-absorbed. They have some good bits. They have a bit of compassion. But for the most part, people are self-absorbed. Everyone's got a malicious side to them. Instead, though, you can recognize that we share in suffering, that both of us are contributing to this world of strife and chaos, where there's a few quiet glimmers here and there, but a lot of misery. Then we no longer feel that one of us is putting themselves over the other. We can feel some sense of solidarity as we suffer in this together. He even suggests we maybe address each other as my fellow sufferer, instead of my good sir, or something like that, which he thinks is misleading.
Yeah, so back onto the topic of art. So it seems like he sees art as something that can relieve us from the pressure of suffering under the will, but at the same time, he kind of sees it as something which can also directly express the will. So how does being exposed to the will directly through art help us relieve the suffering that comes from the will?
Yeah, great question. Let's take the case of music, which he sees as the highest art. So in Schopenhauer's view, what good music captures is the inherent dynamics and structure of the will. So for example, when you hear a Mozart piano sonata, for example, he was a Mozart fan. What you were hearing is the development of tensions and the resolution of those tensions. And a good composer like Mozart never leaves you in either for too long. Mozart builds up some tensions and then resolves them. But you never sit with the resolution because that would get boring. It's always on to new tensions, new resolutions, playing across different levels, different pitches, different timbres. These capture tensions in different ways, and it's a constant churning of tension, resolution, tension, resolution. In Schopenhauer's view, good music like that shows you the inner nature of all things. That really is what the world is like, this constant pattern of tensions. Given that, as your question indicated, you might wonder, how in the world could we enjoy that? How could we enjoy all this strife and suffering if that's what music represents? And his answer is that when you experience it in music, you are seeing a mirror of the world. So you're not directly experiencing the suffer firsthand. You're seeing it in this kind of refracted way that is not directly attached to your own personal body. So you can see it at one step removed. I think of this with the Greek legend of is it Theseus who goes after Medusa, I think, and is it Perseus? Whatever, one of the Aesuses goes after Medusa and uses his shield to look at the reflection of Medusa, so her gaze won't turn him to stone. I think that's roughly the idea with Schopenhauer. So you can lose yourself in music because it reflects something deeply true. There's enough for your mind to really latch on to there. But because you are seeing it as a reflection, you're not yourself engaged in the suffering and the tension that it represents. So it is on the other end of the aesthetic spectrum for him with architecture. So when you look at a good piece of architecture, and he's old school, he's thinking Greek temples, you see a column and you see it supporting a beam, and a really beautiful column and beam help you appreciate the basic tension between rigidity, holding things up, and gravity, which is pulling them down. Those very forces are active in your normal body, and typically it's not very pleasant feeling gravity pull your body down or your body struggling against it. But when you get to see it at a step removed in a piece of architecture, you're able to take in this piece of reality, this piece of will, with a bit of removal, but because it's something deeply real, it's able to capture and hold your attention.
Just interesting. So in that vein, like, seems like he held that absolute music, like stuff that's purely formal without any narrative context, was kind of the best form of art. So how is that so?
Instrumental music is the highest form of art for him because it gets the closest to the deep inner nature of things. Architecture, for example, is relatively superficial because it captures two very specific, ubiquitous forces. In his view, there's rigidity and there's gravity, or roughly attraction and repulsion of physical matter. Those are ubiquitous forces, so it's getting at something real, but it's quite specialized. By contrast, the dynamics you get in music could reflect the tension between gravity and rigidity. It could also reflect the dynamics of human psychology, say the swelling of anxiety and the temporary relief. It could also capture other dynamics, like the life cycle of a plant that struggles against the ground to burst into the air, tries to absorb nutrients as it's being devoured by parasites. Music, because it captures the intrinsic structure of tensions, can match all those things. That puts it on a different level than other forms of art that will capture particular dynamics of particular forces.
Oh, interesting. So, despite what Schopenhauer believed, some art seems moving precisely because it is so deeply central in narrative. For example, metal has a lot of like stuff that's like pretty flashy, a lot of ear candy and so on. So, how can we reconcile Schopenhauer's account with this lived reality? Like, would Schopenhauer be a metalhead for all its intensity and grand instrumental tension and release?
I think it's more likely he would be a metalhead than a punk, because I think punk music is almost always deeply engaged. It's about emotional reactions to concrete aspects of reality. Of course, there's lots of different types of punk, but because it has this real world index, I think he would be opposed to it. That would be like, for him, striving to make a painting of a historical figure latch on to the concrete specifics of the historical situation, as opposed to trying to capture something more universal. By contrast, a good metal band, say Ulcerate out of New Zealand, the sort of tensions they capture are universal features of death, decay, destruction, fear, and anxiety. That's much closer, I think, to the kinds of things that he thinks is at the core of the will, not indexed to any particular political issue, historical moment, but something deep about the human and the universal condition.
Yeah, so I went to a metal concert last month, and during it I had the thought that it seems like metal's much more Schopenhauerian, while punk is like very Hegelian. Like, would you say that statement is a good way to summarize like this conflict with Schopenhauer in art?
I think that sounds pretty good. I do not, since I'm not really a punk fan, I'm a little careful about who I want to attach to it. But I think the deep sort of historical nature of Hegel's philosophy, where he thinks concrete details about episodes of human history reflect deep important facts, that feels much more punk to me than Schopenhauer's sense of every day it's a new form of the same suffering and strife that we've always had.
Yeah, I guess I kind of just said that because it seems like a lot of punk is still dealing with like recognition and historical injustices, and that's something Hegel's like very invested in, like the grand movement of history towards freedom. While like metal is often like just more observant of like the sucky stuff in reality without necessarily offering any solutions.
I think that's right, though. If Hegel is a punk rock philosopher, he's a right wing one, because in his view, the epitome of civilization and the progress of Geist or spirit is roughly Western European Protestant civilization. And he has an extremely dim view about other aspects of other intellectual traditions within humanity.
So then in that case, I'd assume most punk is actually more Marxist, which is like a derivative of Hegel, but in a different vein.
That's quite possible. Yes, I think there's probably plenty of Marxist punk. I also, though, think that Schopenhauer gives us, I think his view about malice as a form of human nature also sheds light on some of the appeal of punk. So, for example, though it's not strictly punk, Pantera's song War Nerve from the Great Southern Trendkill is a song that I really liked in high school. I go back to every time an election goes poorly, even though I don't agree with the Pantera singer's politics. But it's very much just a burst of malice and rage. And you could describe it as being indexed to a socio-political moment, but in a way it's just a musical middle finger pointed in every direction as possible. And Schopenhauer's view of malice as part of the human condition, the human character, makes sense of that. Like, why does it sometimes just feel good to scream at everything and want to lash out in every possible way? It may not be as Nietzsche thinks that we're trying to increase our power. It may just be that there's a part of us that wants to create suffering around us.
So do you think that would mean that metal kind of connects more towards the Thanatos drive, if we're like referring back to Freud, you know, the will towards death or like the will towards aggression and so on? Well, like he could see that like other music, like a lot of hippie music, might be more towards eros, which can sometimes feel not relate to us as much when we're having certain mental states. That positive music might actually make us feel more miserable, while negative like angry music might make us feel better.
I think it could, but for Schopenhauer, the truly great music should be deeper than the difference between compassion or malice. So both compassion and malice at their core involve there's the structural similarity. There's some sort of don't have what I want yet, now I've got it, what next? Of course, it's inverse. With compassion, don't have what I want yet is there is still suffering, how do I alleviate it? Whereas with malice, the don't have what I want yet is there isn't enough suffering, how do I get it? So great music can get to that tension by itself underneath those. More superficial music might be indexed to one of those more directly. And I think Schopenhauer could be okay with that. He would just want us to know that we're missing out on something deeper.
Yeah, so I guess like clarifying, like what do you think in his view makes good art good? And is good art also like a moral good for us?
The main measure he gives for what makes good art good is how deeply does it convey to us true patterns of willing, of dynamics of reality. So it's very much a beauty is truth measure of art. I don't think he rules out that there are other dimensions by which to evaluate art as well. So, for example, he thinks that paintings of oysters cannot be beautiful because, in his view, oysters are just so appetizing that you can't actually bracket your desires when looking at them. Same with pictures of beer. On the other hand, if you have a seafood and beer poster that just perks you up in the morning, I don't think he would say there's anything intrinsically worse about that than other forms of superficial entertainment. Right? Like, if it works for you, if it makes things slightly more tolerable, that's okay. He wouldn't call it great art, but those kinds of superficial appeal can have their value.
Yeah, so I guess going on the topic of like much deeper experience, what makes something sublime, like either art or experience?
Yeah, so he follows Kant and Burke in distinguishing the beautiful from the sublime. The sublime, the key case of the sublime is something like watching a massive storm. Storm heads building up over the horizon, crashing waves against the shore, that kind of thing. For Schopenhauer, following Kant, the key thing about the sublime is not just that you get lost in some form of beauty, but that you do so against the resistance of your own impulses to live. So part of what is so cool about seeing a massive storm when you're able to enjoy it is you feel that flutter of fear, knowing that the storm can harm you. And yet, despite that, you lose yourself in the object. So it has this extra element of contrast beyond what's there in the merely beautiful.
Moving on to back to the topic of persuasion and the ethics of persuasion. As you said earlier, you teach a class on the ethics of persuasion, and it may not be obvious what the driving moral questions in the area are. Can you just explain what some of those big questions in the ethics of persuasion are and how they might apply to our lives?
Absolutely. The question that got me into the topic of persuasion, which has not had a lot of attention by itself in ethics, though there's been lots of stuff around the ethics of communication and the ethics of free speech. The thing that got me into it was the question of, can we persuade each other without moral compromise? And this came out of worries about the increasing polarization in the United States and elsewhere, where it felt like persuading each other on political issues was becoming more and more important, but also more and more difficult. That people weren't able to listen to each other, and that even people who knew the truth weren't able to convince others of that truth. So that was the thing that worried me. Then there was the question of what kinds of moral values should we be looking at? Originally, I was thinking in terms of some moral epistemic notion of rationality, and that's what we should be looking at. But then I gravitated towards the notion of respect. And in a way, this ended up bringing me back to Kant, who I thought I was kind of done with, because Kant is widely regarded as the philosopher of respect. Kant says a lot of things about respect. Some hold up really well. Others just seem kind of weird. But I found a small number of people working in the Kantian tradition who had really insightful things to say about respect and how it features into persuasion. Include Regina Rini and George Tsai in particular, who I've found just super helpful. So in my view, we can get a lot out of looking at different dimensions of respect when we try to persuade each other. For example, one dimension of respect is something like sincerity, actually offering our views to the other as treating them as someone who can handle the truth as we see it. But another type of respect is receptivity, being willing to actually hear them out, treating them as someone we can learn from. But even that doesn't exhaust respect. Another type of respect is a kind of live and let live, where if I respect you in this way, I shouldn't corner you and force you into a conversation. I should respect you may have other things to do with your time besides engage in this particular topic. And then there's the dimension of self-respect, which I also think is something that can be lost, especially when we have incentives to act like a yes man and play nice in certain ways, sell ourselves out, perhaps being sincere and yet not answering to our own values and our own deep projects and concern. So there's a lot to be said about respect. In the book that's coming out, I separate out compassion, with a nod to Schopenhauer, as a separate value. And the idea there is that if we approach respect through this Kantian lens, it's very much focused on our interactions as rational beings. I'm trying to grasp the truth. You're trying to grasp the truth. I'm trying to rationally plan my life. You're trying to rationally plan your life. That's all well and good. But then I imagine Schopenhauer saying, oh, come on. This rationality thing, we all know it's superficial and largely BS. Each of us is a nervous bundle of nerves who sometimes are able to put together coherent sentences and act like a rational being, but we know that's not our core. Our core is insecurity, restlessness, boredom, occasional moments of irrational joy, but that's what really drives us. So I've become convinced we also need to think about compassion in persuasion. So sometimes not just focused on rational being to rational being, but sometimes just trying not to stress each other out, even if that doesn't have any immediate implications. Just trying to show recognition for each other's suffering, even if that doesn't have any immediate bearing on our rational plans or the truth. So for me, those two values, compassion and respect, go a long way. If there were a political philosopher in the room, they would probably say something like, what about justice? Which I also think is an extremely important value. But it's one that, for me, I've felt okay handing off to other people, political philosophers, political scientists. And I think when it comes to person respect, you can go a long way with respect and compassion.
Yeah, so on the subject of compassion and persuasion, persuasion has always been important for the health of our political system. At the very least, it seems to be required to keep us grounded in a shared view of reality. Yet at the same time, persuasion has also been effectively deployed to fragment that shared view of reality, specifically on some hot button topics such as climate change. How can we responsibly deploy persuasion towards productive discourse without falling victim to the same epistemic vices that have created the polarized situation that we see today?
It's a great question. And that is the thing that I worried most about. I think the first thing to say is that there are no easy answers in this. So I would like to say that it is never appropriate to manipulate each other's, to play off each other's identities, to try to deceive each other, to lie outright. But unfortunately, I think there are cases in which that's the appropriate thing to do. However, I think the way things are now, truly respectful, compassionate persuasion is not used as an option as often as it should be. And that especially if we find a time when we need the right sort of environment where we can give each other the attention and trust that is needed for respectful persuasion to actually make a difference. So for me, I think I've come to realize the main obstacles are not directly moral. It's not that people don't care enough about respect and compassion, because I think most people do. It's instead environmental features where, for example, if we have an audience and the audience is hoping that we win over the other guy, that adds a certain incentive to shut the other person down, to shame them instead of persuade them. I think this happens all the time on social media, though there are instances of respectful persuasion over social media, but it's relatively rare. Another factor is trust. I think we sometimes overestimate how easy it should be for others to trust us. And with Schopenhauer in mind, it would be better for us to compassionately recognize that people are reasonably withholding of their trust. Trust is something that has to be earned and maintained, and that only when we have gotten people in a condition where they can reasonably trust us and where they're not faced with distractions that tear away their attention, then we have a real chance of good faith engagement with each other, rational being, suffering being to rational being and suffering being.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially with social capital and peacefully kind of like coming to an agreement for reform to address the shared suffering that we all have. So I guess in closing, Schopenhauer is best known as a pessimist. How can we be good Schopenhauerians without becoming misanthropic?
That's a lovely question, because it's one that he wrestled with himself. There's a paper coming out on Schopenhauer and the accusation of misanthropy. He gives a relatively straightforward answer to this, which I alluded to before, but I think is a pretty good pessimistic closing note. So he says, if you want to feel connection to other people, don't focus on the quality of their intellect first. Why? Because people are largely self-deceived. They have biased perceptions. They don't get reality right all the time. Also, don't focus on the quality of their character, because even though you might lie to yourself and say, oh, my friends are pretty good people, if you took a truly honest look, you would see your friends and loved ones are also largely self-absorbed with streaks of malice. Instead, he thinks we should just focus on the fact that we all share in suffering, and that if you simply attend to the fact that another person is suffering, you've got a pretty good chance, no guarantee, of feeling some sense of compassion and unity with them. And I do think that is, at least at this moment in our history, one of the most powerful and believable unifying messages we have.
At UW, you have started writing some books of philosophy, and you have published some books before. Could you tell us about your literary career at UW?
Sure. I was hired originally as a specialist in Immanuel Kant's philosophy. I feel a little bit weird about this. I think the reason they hired me is because there was a sense that to be a respectable philosophy department, you had to have a Kant specialist. Even though after I got here, I realized very quickly very few people actually cared about Kant and cared if I taught Kant and cared if I wrote about Kant. As a result, these days I teach very little Kant and write very little about Kant, even though I still like Kant, still a fun philosopher. So when I got here, the first thing that I gravitated towards was a project that I'd been thinking about in graduate school about compassion and metaethics. And it was a project that I got really mixed feedback about from people in grad school. Some of the faculty there told me it was really great, or at least promising, even though they thought I was wrong. They thought, oh, this is an innovative way to be wrong. But then I had another member of my dissertation committee tell me that he discouraged me from pursuing the project in, quote, the strongest possible terms, and that there was not a single new thought there. So I put it on the back burner for a little bit, including 2 years I spent in Australia and sort of a postdoc before coming here. So once I got to UW, I realized no one really cared if I was writing about Kant. I had this other project on compassion that I really wanted to do, so I dove into that. In retrospect, it's a very, very much a first book, meaning I wanted to dot all the I's, cross all the T's, reference all the literature. It's not a terribly readable book, though I still kind of stand by what I wrote there. As a result of it not being terribly readable, not a terribly large amount of people read it, but a few people did read it and liked it. And now there's a little cluster of people, of us with similar views, defending compassion or empathy or something like that, from a particular angle as a way of getting reality right. Part of that book connected with me getting more and more into Schopenhauer, and then found that I could teach Schopenhauer, and those classes filled pretty well, and undergraduates like Schopenhauer. So that turned into a large part of my writing. Then after the 2016 presidential election, I felt the need to do something other than history of philosophy or abstract metaethics. So I got interested in the ethics of persuasion, put together a class with some help from Ian Schnee and other colleagues. That class went pretty well, and that's turned into a book, which is in the final stages now. It's going to be coming out from University of Chicago Press, maybe spring next year, on the ethics of persuasion. So I'm still kind of juggling these things, but that's been the trajectory.
Do you know what your book is going to be called?
The title, which is near finalized, though there's chances for tweaks, is Ethical Persuasion, How to Change Minds Without Lies, Bullshit, or Moral Compromise.
Nice. And I think you mentioned you were writing a book about Schopenhauer himself. Can you tell us a bit about what you're thinking of doing for that book?
Absolutely. The Schopenhauer idea originally came out of the persuasion book idea. When I was pitching the persuasion book idea, which was meant as a general audience one, I got mixed feedback. And one thing I realized was that I was trying to do two things at once. I was trying to write a book about the ethics of persuasion, and I thought Schopenhauer was really fun. Eventually, I realized it would be better to pull those apart. So there's a bit of Schopenhauer in the persuasion book, but the Schopenhauer is really fun part I pulled off. I was inspired by a book by Nicholas Bomarito called Seeing Clearly, A Buddhist Guide to Life. It was a fun, philosophical self-help book, and which I read with a friend of mine, and he suggested, well, what about a Schopenhauerian version? Which at first I thought, well, that's kind of silly. And then I realized, no, that sort of is the book that I want to write. So that book, I've got a couple chapters down. The plan is to finish it over the summer. So it's less of an interpretive book, though I do some make some interpretive moves there, and more of a how to live a tolerable life self-help book.
All right, one final question, and a much more general question. We think a lot about how we're supposed to square philosophy with our lives, whether philosophy is just an intellectual exercise, or whether or not our confidence in one or another philosophy that we read in some class should lead us to adhere to it. Of course, the answer is probably somewhere in between. How do you navigate this tension, both from the perspective of someone possibly undergoing or having undergone these same struggles, but also in terms of the advice you might give to philosophy students as a faculty member?
Another great question. I think the first thing I would say, reflecting on my own mistakes, is that there is some value in trying to balance the drive to figure out what to think and a wariness of easy labels. So it's very tempting to give yourself an ism when you come to a philosophical view. And sometimes that's essential to be able to dive into an area. Like, how do I start caring about this? Oh, well, I'm an empiricist, or I'm a naturalist, or I'm a non-naturalist, or whatever. That impulse is important. It can be useful for self-respect, but there's always a bit of a danger that once you give yourself a label, you're now more in the game of defending your team than in honestly trying to engage with others and figure out the truth. So I think that's a tension. I don't think there's an easy way out of it, but just knowing not to get stuck on one side or another, not to never try on a label. I think that would be a mistake because then it's hard to have an orientation and any sense of self-respect. On the other hand, to stick to a label no matter what, I think isolates you from others who reject that label and keeps you from fairly evaluating certain things. So I would say celebrating that tension, taking on labels, occasionally taking them off. And I do think in our fragmented social time, philosophy, when we're willing to set aside labels, has an incredible unifying power. And I've found that when I can get into conversations with anyone, many people will roll their eyes when they first hear that I'm a philosopher, or, if they don't do it, I can tell externally, I can tell they're doing it internally. But once we get into questions about what's real, how should we live, what really matters, and I show some philosophically attuned curiosity to some of their core opinions, it's amazing the possibilities for human connection that come up with that. And so I think my final thing would be to say to prioritize your ability to form those kinds of connections over any particular viewpoint or school of thought.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on, Professor Marshall.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fun.